from the hardware about the stories that always make the news. Our town, wherever I may roam, I'll always have a place that I call home. Our town, it's very plain to see, there'll always be a part of you in me.
The city of Peterborough is located on the popular Trent Waterway at the head of the Otonabee River. Long admired for its enterprising spirit, the community had its beginnings in one of the most ambitious immigration ventures associated with the opening up of our country.
Hello, I'm Barry Penhale. Peterborough is a very historic city, numbering among her famous citizens the inventor of standard time, exceptional authors and poets, the father of the world-renowned Peterborough Canoe Company, several of Canada's leading industrialists, and a former Canadian Prime Minister and Nobel Peace Prize winner. Small wonder that a visit to Peterborough provides many answers for the history seeker.
In 1825, the British government was eager to resolve the problem of hunger and overpopulation that plagued much of Ireland. With the potato famine barely behind them, the majority of Irish farmers lived in abject poverty. Nearing the end of 4 years of financial relief, the British government decided a more permanent solution was needed. A policy of immigration to settle land in Upper Canada was initiated. Successful applicants to receive free passage, a land grant, and provisions of food. Peter Robinson, born in New Brunswick, was chosen as superintendent of this ambitious project. Serving under Brock in the War of 1812, Robinson had been a member in the Upper Canada Parliament from 1817 to 1824. Setting out from Ireland in 9 ships, 2,000 homesteaders made their way for the New World. Although few white men had ever set foot in the region north of Rice Lake, the Irish, arriving in the summer of 1825, found a small settlement named Scott's Plains, after Adam Scott, who had previously established a mill. The arrivals quickly adapted to their new homeland, and as Scott's Plains grew, it came to be called Peterborough, honoring the efforts of Peter Robinson. These little sketches of the growing community were rendered by a young man in 1845 who rose to international prominence. Sanford Fleming came to live in the home of the family of Dr. John Hutchison. His skills in lithography and surveying eventually led to his appointment as surveyor of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Fleming is also recognized as the inventor of standard time and the designer of the first Canadian postage stamp. Reaping the harvests of timber from the widespread tracts of the Canadian Shield, combined with the exporting of grain, created a strong economy which bolstered the thriving community. The Peterborough Lumber Company became one of the larger employers and was soon complemented by a wide range of diverse industries. These included Quaker Oats, Westclocks, Delaval, Outboard Marine, and the Edison Electric Company, known today as Canadian General Electric. From this era, Joseph Lavelle, founder of Canada Packers, and George A. Cox, president of 43 companies, including Imperial Life and the Canadian Bank of Commerce, became 2 of Canada's wealthiest industrialists. Incorporated as a city in 1904, Peterborough became the commercial and administrative center for the region and was known nationwide as the Electric City. The Autonomy and Trent water system not only provided hydropower to attract industry, but was considered as a viable alternative for commercial shipping. In 1904, the Trent Valley Canal Association was formed and commenced a full-scale publicity campaign. Their objective was to promote the shipping of Western grain by barge down the waterway from Lake Huron to Montreal. As part of the system, a huge concrete lift lock, the highest in the world, an engineering feat of its time, was opened for traffic. A flurry of steamer construction ensued amid vivid dreams of being on the main commercial highway from the prairies to the Atlantic. Though this vision was never realized, the development of the canal system did encourage a new growth industry in the Kawartha Lakes district: tourism. The Peterborough Lift Lock is a monument to the skill of Canadian civil engineering at the turn of the century. Since its opening, untold tonnage of commercial and pleasure craft have been locked through, raising and lowering the equivalent height of 6 stories. It remains as a landmark to an age of adventure and enterprise. The industrious past of Peterborough is only one of the foundation stones the community is built on. Peterborough County is recognized as a seedbed of Canadian cultural identity. As we reach into the past to honor those skilled in the arts who have stoked the warming fires of a nation's expression, we find this region unparalleled. Well-known personalities, such as Robertson Davies and Lester B. Pearson, have called Peterborough home. The beauty and ruggedness of the landscape have been constant themes expressed by such individuals as renowned sculpturist Catherine Wallace. The Strickland family, who lived in the area, also had a great impact. The 2 Strickland sisters, Susanna Moody and Catherine Parr Trail, have given Canadians detailed accounts of the experiences of early settlement. The Canadian Settler's Guide and Plant Life in Canada, penned in the 1800s, are noted works of Catherine Parr Trail.
It is truly cheering to see how fondly home is spoken of here, for it is by that endearing word that England is known. And when I say England, of course I mean the United Kingdom. There's a magic in the word that I cannot describe. It is a word that conjures up memories of the past on which the heart loves to linger. I must tell you a little anecdote on this point. I called one day while I was in the bush at the home of an old man of 80, a soldier and a gentleman who had been here 40 years. He seldom got any tidings from home, and I happened to have in my pocketbook a primrose which a friend had sent me in a letter. I placed the primrose on the old man's knee and I said, "Did you ever see a flower like that?" The old man picked up the flower and he turned it over and over, and when he recognized it, he bent his aged head and he wept like a child, so violently that I was alarmed. Who can tell what thoughts this little flower had awakened in the old man's heart? It was too sacred a sight for a stranger's eyes. I know that he couldn't have spoken, and I was sure that I could not. And so I wrote a note in pencil and I promised to call on him again.
Author and botanist Catherine Parr Traill's writings are enjoyed to this day. Betty Galvin acquainted me with another literary figure from the past century.
I think the general public know the names Catherine Parr Traill and Susanna Moody and identify these outstanding literary figures with the city of Peterborough and the Kawartha Lakes. But Isabella Valancy Crawford, you've introduced me to this woman today, and these books and many more were written by her.
Yes, he was lost somewhere along the way. There's a renewed interest in Isabella Valancy Crawford, fortunately. She was born in Dublin in 1850. Her father was a doctor. The family emigrated to Canada in 1858. They initially lived in Paisley, Ontario, on the Saugeen River. Her father was an alcoholic, unfortunately, and he also turned out to be an embezzler of funds. He became treasurer of Eldersley Township in Bruce County, and he absconded with $500, and the family sort of picked up and left during the night. Robert Strickland found them and felt sorry for them and had this lovely, gorgeous home in Lakefield and said, "Why don't you come and live in my house and be a doctor in Lakefield, because we do not have a doctor." That is what they did. They moved to Lakefield. His practice did not increase, and eventually they decided to come to Peterborough to live. She started writing in Lakefield, and more so in Peterborough. They attended St. John's Anglican Church. They rented pews in 1871, 1872, and then they were forced to move, and they moved to the corner of George and Edinburgh Street, and her father died while they were there in 1875, July the 3rd. Isabella was more or less supporting the family with her writings at this time. She's the first truly Canadian voice. Up until this time, people were writing as they wrote in England and in the old country. Now we suddenly have somebody who's talking about the strong northwest wind. A really Canadian landscape is entering into her poetry.
She was really in that sort of, I guess, pre-Confederation era of poets, sort of a member of a kind of a group of seven of her own.
I was just going to say, she's comparable to the group of seven. Suddenly there's someone writing with a Canadian voice, as they painted with Canadian brush. She died on February the 12th, 1886, and she had only turned 36 on Christmas Day. She's buried in Peterborough's Little Lake Cemetery. So the week before her death, she republished a poem called The Rose of a Nation's Thanks in a Toronto newspaper. And when she was buried in Peterborough, there was a beautiful one single white bloom with an unsigned card that said, "The Rose of a Nation's Thanks," left on her grave.
I wonder if you would, Betty, read a poem for me by Isabella Valancy Crawford.
Of course, of course. I'll read something from Malcolm's Katie. From his far wigwam sprang the strong north wind, and rushed with war cry down steep ravines, and wrestled with the giants of the woods, and with his ice club beat the swelling crests of the deep water courses into death, and with his chill foot froze the whirling leaves of dun and gold and fire in icy banks, and smote the tall reeds to the hardened earth, and sent his whistling arrows o'er the plains, scattering lingering herds, and sudden paused when he had frozen all the running streams, and hunted with his war cry all the things that breathed about the woods. High through the snow beneath the low-hung sky, and all was silent in the wilderness.
The history of Peterborough County and the Kawartha Lakes cannot be told without the all-important theme of boat building. Since the mid-1800s, the community has gained prominence in this field. At the Centennial Museum, Jerry Stevenson spoke to me about this indigenous Peterborough industry.
Jerry, this is an absolutely magnificent canoe, and I know that you have a great interest in canoes and watercraft generally. How did you come by that interest?
According to the Peterborough Examiner, back in 1912, my grandfather built the first board canoe, which became known, as they referred to it, as the famous Peterborough canoe. He started back in the 1850s, and at that point there were birch bark canoes, which was his favorite, and the people in Lakefield were making dugouts, which they were carving out of great logs of virgin timber that were coming down the river, and by the thousand they were carving canoes out of those logs. The log canoes, however, to his satisfaction, let's say they didn't meet his satisfaction because they weighed about 200 pounds and you couldn't carry them.
Not nice and light and buoyant like this little fella.
This one is 12 and a half pounds.
When would this canoe have been built?
This was in the 1892 catalog of the Ontario Canoe Company, and the material is 1/8 of an inch thick. There was, at that time, quite a contest among canoe builders in North America to build light canoes, and I believe this is the lightest canoe ever built out of wood.
Really? And cedar?
It's cedar. This is the cedar rib construction technique which my grandfather patented in 1879 in Canada and 1884 in the United States. 1883, I'm sorry. He patented this canoe here and the longitudinal cedar strip, which is so popular. It's the same material going the opposite direction. The original one was wide boards, and they were all known as Peterboroughs, so long as it was made on a mold and with steam bent members to it and an open deck that was so familiar. That was a Peterborough or Canadian canoe. It could be that this was the first manufactured product out of Peterborough that was of particular note, aside from, of course, lumber and so on that came from a number of places. This was something particular to Peterborough. And it didn't matter who built them. They were known as Peterboroughs long before the Peterborough Canoe Company. If the builder was in the Peterborough area, he was building Peterborough canoes. It started to become known around the world in the 1860s and 70s. The 1870s it came into its own because by 1885 we know they were on every continent and on some islands. Of course, canoes are Canadian, and they're far more prominent here than anywhere, although they are used by the International Olympics for all countries. You'll still find far more canoes in Canada than you will anywhere else.
The music of the Irish is one tradition that lingers today as a tribute to the days of Peter Robinson. It has been cultivated and enjoyed by descendants of the early immigration. Kevin Leahy shared with me the story of the music.
That was just wonderful, Kevin.
Thank you.
What's that called?
The swallowtail jig.
The swallowtail jig.
Right.
Has that been around a long time?
Well, it's around this long. I remember playing it in the presence of my grandfather,
Is that right?
and he seemed, I've forgotten whether he requested it or not. I think he did.
Did he? Yeah.
So it's around that long.
I guess a lot of the people who came here from Ireland brought musical skills with them.
Well, they brought some skills, but I think more importantly, they brought a deep-rooted love of music and the fun that goes with it. My father played the violin by ear. My mother played the piano, having had some training, but I think what kept it alive with both of them was their love for it.
For the most part, was the music impromptu or was it largely written down?
They learned probably from another person or from hearing other people play, because there just was not the opportunity to go to take lessons, formal lessons from someone. But in doing that, they accomplished two things. They kept the music alive, and they had great fun. But I think a custom that developed over the years made a great contribution to family life, to social life, and to the preservation of music as they knew it, and that was the house parties.
What is it about the Irish that has given us such passionate, artistic people?
Well, we know that centuries ago, Ireland was a seat of learning. And while the Irish who came to this area were poverty-stricken, I think some of that love of culture and art was in their blood. I think they brought it here and developed it in whatever ways they could, and it still abounds.
Would you play another tune for me?
I'd like to play one that my father used to play. It's a schottische.
The music, the stories, the people. Peterborough's contribution to the heritage of Canada is significant. Having only touched on some of the themes here, a future visit to this region has been duly noted in my journal as a must.
I'll see the folks up on Main Street who will always take the time for a story over coffee at the old Five and Dime. The flag on our town hall through the years has flown free, a tribute to our hometown's history. Our town, wherever I may roam, I'll always have a place that I call home. Our town, it's very plain to see, there'll always be a part of you in me. There'll always be a part of you in me. There'll